McKim.
Thank you, Michaela, for that that wonderful introduction, and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for being here, choosing this session to spend a little bit of time with us. As Michaela said, love to have you have your cameras on. We're trying to create a bit of community here. And also, when I speak, I like to see how my words are landing on folks. That way I know whether I need to say a little bit more to explain what I just said, or if I've reached the mark with my words. Good, because I could talk about this topic for hours and hours and on end, but we don't have hours and hours and on end. So I want to make sure that what I say is coming across to you, and we're addressing what you would like to make sure we address. So we're talking about having difficult conversations. And I would love to hear from you. What are some difficult conversations that you would like to be able to have? Let's see, we got 45 people, so feel free to type into the chat, or you can come off mute and raise your hand, either one, and I'll be capturing those for later on. So negative performance feedback. Wow, what a good one. Okay. That is a difficult conversation for sure. Ethical communication issues. Okay, good. Another good one. When a supervisor or person in power says something problematic. Yes, another good one. Or a coworker. Okay, another good one. We had an AmeriCorps member tell us that the AmeriCorps was systematically racist because it was attainable for low-income work. Excellent. Interesting comment. Interesting comment. Okay. Good, good, good. Let's see why we are focusing on girls STEM as a priority. Right, I'm assuming that means people are asking why we should, and we need that, and that's a difficult conversation to have, the discussion of why we should. So that's great. All right, how to talk to someone. Oh, so Clark was at our last session. How to talk to someone who's you think is a performance artist. Yes, excellent. Let's see. Anne says, I'd like to be able to talk with friends who are BIPOC about issues of race in the news without saying something that is offensive to them. Okay, excellent, excellent point. How to interrupt racism in conversation meetings, etc. I think we kind of had that one before. Great. All right, so thank you for that. Let's see. So I've captured those, and I'll try to bring those back later on. Along with, can I actually put those in right now? I won't put them in just yet. Along with, and I'm going to share my screen now. Let's see, what is that one? These are, all right, first of all, let me know when you're seeing my screen. All right, so those that you mentioned, along with some of these that I have heard and others with whom I've worked have heard, are these difficult conversations, right? The whole notion of talking about colorblindness is a difficult conversation. Affinity groups. Everyone know what affinity groups are, right? So just having a discussion about whether to have an affinity group or not is a difficult conversation. Or when we're in our faith groups, it can be difficult to have conversations around religion. Right? So these are just a few to get our brains going on what we're talking about, what we want to be able to do after this is over. So I'm going to talk a bit about setting the table for these discussions, some conversation basics. What are conversations? What are the components? What are some conversational norms that you can employ to make these difficult conversations a little easier and a little more productive? What are some skills and barriers to having productive, difficult conversations? What are some guidelines you can use? What are some responses you can use when someone says something that is offensive? And then I won't talk too much about the faith context. We'll kind of wrap it up after we get to the responses section. So that's where we're headed. Let me start off with talking a bit about communication. And that word, communication, we frequently think of that as one person trying to get their point across. And that's not what communication is. Co means two or equal, right? Two people are in this engaged in an activity together. So there is a sender of a message that's trying to be made, and there is a receiver of that message. So here's my question for you. Who is responsible for ensuring that the message gets across? Who is responsible? We have from Tracy the sender, Jennifer says the sender, Caitlin says the sender, Danielle says everyone, Beth says I think both. According to Shannon and Weaver, who created the Shannon and Weaver communication model. Oh, okay, 100th birthday party there. The sender is responsible for making sure that the message gets across. Why is that? Why is it the sender? It's the sender because only the sender knows what that message is. The receiver doesn't know, only the sender knows. This is where we talk about this notion of the difference between intent and impact. When the sender sends a message, says something, there's an intent there. But the impact of someone's words can be different. So that's why feedback is so important. We talk about feedback loops. The receiver needs to provide feedback to the sender, and the sender needs to solicit that feedback if it's not already given, so that the sender has some idea of whether the message as intended actually got through. Now, what makes this complicated? Well, the sender of a message has experiences, backgrounds, culture that the sender has grown up in. So words that come from that person have certain meaning for that person. The receiver is not the sender. The receiver also, though, has grown up in a culture, has experiences. So words have a meaning to the receiver based on their experiences. So if we're not the same person, that means we don't have the exact same experiences and culture and background, right? So the words we choose as a sender that have a certain meaning to them may not have the same meaning to the receiver. So that's why it's so important for the sender who has the intent to solicit active listening feedback from the receiver to make sure that the intent actually comes across as the impact. Right? So that's we call kind of the physical aspects of communication. The sender utters words, the receiver hears those words, has to interpret them, and should, in the technology world, I have a degree in computer science, we use the terms acts and nacks. Acknowledgements and non-acknowledgements. So the receiver has to send an act back, an acknowledgement that at least something was heard, right? So that's one thing that can make it a conversation difficult, just not grasping the intent of a message because of physical dynamics. Along with that is this notion of meaning. Research has shown that only 7% of the meaning of a word is derived by the word itself. 38% of the meaning is derived from the paralinguistics, the way a word is spoken. Ever see a show or be in a conversation where someone will say, yes? What does that mean? Yes. The inflection that I used versus a yes. So the way that a word is spoken can inflect meaning. And then 55% of meaning of a word is derived from facial expressions. And that's why it's so difficult as we're in this pandemic where we wear masks. It's difficult when you're talking with someone to really grasp what they're saying, what they're meaning, because you can't see all of their facial expressions. So this is another part of what can make conversations difficult. And then, even if we understand the meaning, even if the impact is what the sender intended, we have to think about this notion of thinking styles. Ted Herman came up with his whole brain thinking model. And he talks about 4 different thinking styles, and you see them portrayed here. Logical thinkers are into facts and figures, and the bottom line, as Joe Friday from Dragnet would say, just the facts, man. Then there are the creative types who are, they see the big picture, the connections between things, and their focus, their drive is to have fun with whatever it is they're doing. And then we have the relational folks who are really focused on their feelings and the feelings of those around them. And then there are the practical folks like me who focus in on organization, on follow through, on structure. Right? So we have these different thinking styles. And what Herman said is that it's not that we each only have one thinking style. We can exhibit all of these thinking styles. But when we are stressed, when we are in a heated conversation, we have a go-to thinking style. Right? And mine is practical. Right? So think about this. If you're in a conversation with someone, a heated conversation, then you're a logical person. And that other person is a relational person. And you're spouting facts and figures that prove your point. This relational person, facts and figures just go in one ear and out the other ear because they're thinking about and focusing on their feelings and your feelings. So you're doing one of these things in your conversation. Message is just not getting across. So think for a minute, what's your preferred thinking style? Type it in the chat. What's your preferred thinking style? Let's see what we have in the room. You know, creative, practical, relational, logical, relational, a lot of relational people here. And you know, people who volunteer, I would suspect, are relational in nature. Right? We do it because we like to deal with people's feelings, and it makes us feel good. A couple of creatives. Okay, great. So, we have the thinking styles to deal with. But even if the thinking styles are matching, even if you're getting the message just fine, we still have another aspect that can throw us off with these difficult conversations. And that is cognitive dissonance. Anyone heard this term of cognitive dissonance before? Yeah. So cognitive dissonance, and here's a little cartoon for you to read from.
Hi, yes.
So the notion of cognitive dissonance is that we have beliefs and values, and we are biased, and this is what's called an affirmation bias. We are biased to seek out and find data that affirms our beliefs and values. If we are presented with data that contrasts and conflicts with our values and beliefs, we tend to stick with our values and beliefs. So that's why so many people are in denial about there being racism in New Hampshire. Their values and beliefs are that they're a good person, that New Hampshire's so white, 90+%. We don't even have people of color here in the state. How can we have a racism problem? Yet the data says we're only 90% white, we're not at 100. The data says that people of color are disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. The data says that more people of color proportionally are incarcerated than white people. So we have data versus values and beliefs. And what generally wins out is the values and beliefs. So it's that cognitive dissonance that we have to learn how to deal with, as well as just getting across the meanings of the words. All right, so let's talk about some components of difficult conversations. This is based on work from Doug Stone, Bruce Patton, and Sheila Keane, that they captured in their book, Difficult Conversations. What they say is every difficult conversation is actually 3 conversations in one. The first conversation is about just the facts, ma'am. What actually happened? What happened in the situation that is being discussed? What's the plot? The second conversation is about the feelings that have been engendered by the words. If I say something to you that is derogatory, you have a visceral reaction to that. You have a feeling that you've been insulted. And you have to process those feelings. Right? So that's another conversation that's going on in your head. The third conversation is around identity. If I say something that puts you off guard or doesn't make sense to you or is derogatory to you, you're probably thinking, am I a bad person for you to say something like that? Am I worthy of being loved as a human? So those 3 conversations are going on in every one difficult conversation. And we need to understand that and deal with that to be able to have productive conversations. A tip that the authors in the book bring to the table is shifting to a learning stance. Because the who's right, what was the intent, who's to blame question, that's a matter of debate. The feelings, the uncontrollable urges based on what was said, that can lead you astray. The identity question, you can mire yourself in, am I a good person forever and not have a productive conversation. So what they recommend is, first of all, having your feelings, this is their quote, have your feelings or they will have you. If you don't acknowledge that you have feelings in these conversations, these difficult conversations, the conversation will control you. You will not control the conversation. Don't think about who's right. Think about understanding the other's story. This is what comes to mind for me is St. Francis's prayer. I first seek to understand, then to be understood. And don't assume that they mean it. Back to, we talked about separation of intent versus impact. If someone says something and it comes across incorrectly to you, if it comes across as offensive to you, don't assume that they were trying to be offensive. Now, they may have been, but don't assume it. Okay? Because if you assume it, you may not be correct. And you may put them on the, and you may say something offensive that puts them on the defense, and you're not getting anywhere with that. So abandon the blame game, take a learning stance, seek to understand what was meant. All right. So we've been going for a bit here. One more bit on conversational norms before we start having some conversations. These are some norms that you can use in your workplace, with groups that you're part of, or even think about how to incorporate when you're having one-on-one conversations with people. So first of all, and especially when you're dealing with race or with an emotional topic, stay engaged. We have a tendency when we get into a difficult conversation to turn away. But we need to stay engaged, because if we don't stay engaged, if we don't engage, we'll never get anywhere. Next, and this is more for a group setting, share airtime. When someone says something, let a couple of other folks speak before you speak again. Next, be patient with yourself and others. Be patient with yourself and with others in a conversation. You have a set of experiences. They're probably different than the experiences of the speaker. If you don't understand something, be patient. Don't just fly off the handle that someone said something that was derogatory or that you didn't understand. By the same token, be patient with others. Give them time to understand. Next, speak your truth as you're able. Speak your truth. Make I statements. Don't try to speak someone else's truth, right? Because you're not them. You don't know their whole intent. Notice your judgments. We're not saying don't have judgments. We're inviting you to notice those judgments, because it is in noticing those judgments that you realize that you may be interpreting something in a way that was not intended. We're all teachers and we're all learners. We all have something to teach and we all have something to learn. As parents, you know that you're a parent, but you have something to learn from your kids, right? Respect confidentiality, particularly in difficult conversations. Respect confidentiality, set up from the front. And we've heard the term creating a safe space for a conversation. Anybody heard that term, safe space, before? Where you want to make it where each party feels that they can say what they honestly feel. Right? So there's this notion of a safe space, and there's been an evolution to a notion of a brave space where people don't just feel comfortable to be, but they feel comfortable to speak and feel comfortable they can be brave enough to speak. Okay. So that's an evolution, and I really like the further evolution that Dr. Eric Law from the Kaleidoscope Institute came up with. He came up with this notion of a gracious space. And the gracious space is one where, yes, you're safe to just be, but you don't have to be brave to speak. You're invited to speak, and you're invited by others to speak, not just by the person in power. And it's a no judgment zone. You know, the Planet Fitness no judgment zone. You're creating this space for this conversation to have in a no judgment zone. And so what's said in a difficult conversation doesn't leave the parties who are in that conversation. That allows for that vulnerability to get through the challenging topic. Next, expect and accept non-closure. Expect and accept non-closure. We've been talking about and experiencing this situation around racism for over 400 years. It's not going to be solved tomorrow. It's not going to be solved next week. It will probably not be solved in our lifetimes. Expect and accept non-closure. Difficult conversations may not be closed in 10 minutes. Some conversations have to take longer. So accept that. It's okay. And then, oops and ouch. This is one of my favorites. If you say something and as soon as it leaves your lips, you recognize that what you intended was not the way it came out, you can say, oops. And that lets the other person or anyone within hearing shot know that you know that what you said was not what you meant. And there's an opportunity to unpack that. Conversely, ouch. If you hear something that doesn't land on you properly, you can say, ouch. You're not making a judgment on anybody or the person who said it. You're just letting that person and everyone know that something that was said didn't hit you right. And there's an opportunity to unpack that situation. So these are some conversational norms you can use to think about creating that gracious space for having these difficult conversations. Do these make sense? Right. You see some heads nodding and people are off camera, and that's okay, but thank you all for nodding. So now we're going to do a little exercise. We're going to get into breakouts, and we're going to have you talk about what skills you currently have around having difficult conversations and how you can strengthen them. And what are the barriers to having a good, productive conversation about a difficult topic? We're going to break you up into twos and give you 8 minutes for this little conversation. Oh, welcome back. So, as usual, not enough time, right? Just getting into it, sort of. So that first question about what skills you have and how you can develop them, that's for you, your introspection, for you internally. But that next question, what are some barriers? That's something I'd love to hear some of what you all came up with. Either type in the chat or feel free to come off mute and share what are the barriers that you came up with, that you identified to having good, productive conversations. Willful ignorance is a barrier. Yeah, difficult emotions, levels of authority in your audience. Yeah. Okay, good barriers. Wanting to be nice. Excellent. Anxious about confrontation. That's the wanting to be nice. Difference in culture. Many of the want to be likes. Yes, we're taught to be likable, right? My own bad listening skills. Yeah. Wanting to maintain a good relationship, feelings when you can recognize them. I'm too direct, and many don't want to receive a direct message. Okay. Lack of attention for long-term conversations. Yes. Many of these difficult topics do require long-term, multiple conversations, not just one, right? Identities wrapped up in opinions. Ah, yes, the us versus them, the tribes. Tribal nature. Excellent, excellent, excellent. So let me share with you a little bit. You've all come up with, I actually used to be work for Hewlett-Packard Enterprise in the Learning and Development Department. I was chief of staff for the technical training division. And one of the things that I learned and I really have brought into all my presentations is the wisdom of the crowd, the wisdom of the audience. the audience knows a lot of the stuff. This is not rocket science. So you all really did come up with so much of what the barriers are because you know it, you live them. Here's some ways to think about some of those barriers. Not just between the people with where they are, where their heads, where their mindset is, but what's going on in the community, the group or association around you in this conversation. How does what's going on in the world impact your conversation? You know, we've been talking about, many of us have been talking about race for decades. But after last summer, those same discussions take on different meaning, right? What perspectives are people coming from? What's their motivation to be part of this difficult conversation or lack of motivation? If someone doesn't want to be in a conversation, are they going to be attentive? Are they going to be doing active listening? Difficult to say. What's the experience? We already talked about when we talked about communication. What's the experience of each person? What's the background? Is there a power dynamic? And one of the difficult conversation kind of questions was around that power dynamic. What do you do when there is a power dynamic in play? Okay. Sheila Heen and Bruce Patton and Doug Stone have a whole, I think there are 2 or 3 pages in the back of the book on that power dynamic. When gender's in play, we're taught not to talk about, what is it we're taught not to talk about? Race, religion, gender, sex, right? So it's a taboo subject. So there are feelings that creep in when we start to talk about those difficult topics, like equal pay, right? Race, really racially charged. Generally, many times, there's an elephant in the room, the unspoken issue behind the issue. And that elephant in the room can be a barrier to having a productive conversation. People say, well, I'm not smart enough to have this conversation. Bull, you're smart enough. You may not think you have all the right words, and you're going to stumble. We're all human. We're all going to stumble through these conversations. That should not prevent us from having them. And many of you already said not wanting to create tension, wanting to keep the peace, wanting to keep the relationship. So these are barriers to having good and productive conversations. With that, we want to then talk about, well, how do you overcome those barriers? What are some guidelines that you can use? What are some guidelines you can follow to have difficult conversations? So guess what? We just got back. We're going to breakouts again. But this time, we're going to go in groups of 4. And talk about what are some of the guidelines that you can use for having challenging conversations.
Okay, I will open the rooms. Might need to move a few people around, but here we go. There we go.
And we have people in the waiting room? Wow.
Yeah,
Yeah.
those are the people who are not joining their rooms. They're the same ones that didn't go in last time. So
And our
we just-
captioner.
yes.
Captioner,
Yeah, right,
captioner.
yeah.
Give her a break.
Okay.
With
Yeah.
them, I guess.
Well, a little smoother going into the rooms this time.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Gotta put a timer on. We'll do 7 minutes.
Great. And it looks like there are 4 people in almost all of the rooms. Nobody's alone.
That's good.
We're good.
All right. Forty-six. 46.
We got some big CDC news from just a few minutes ago.
Oh,
Really?
what was
Yeah.
that?
Well, fully vaccinated people are allowed to safely stop wearing masks inside most places, unless they're super crowded, like a plane or a prison.
So that was CDC federal.
Yes, yeah, just a
Oh.
few minutes ago, I just got this notification.
Yeah,
That's
well,
cool. Interesting. I'm
yeah,
still gonna do it.
Yeah.
You know.
Yep.
Yeah.
not time yet.
No, I don't think so.
I thought, wasn't it supposed to be like 70 or 80% of people vaccinated before they were going to give that guidance?
That I thought
we're at, like,
so.
40? Like, we're just still pretty low, aren't we?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Got about 4 minutes.
Okay, yeah, I just looked in the US, our total fully vaccinated rate is 35.4%.
Oh, we are not quite there.
Wow.
No.
Wow. I wonder why they listed it.
Yeah, I don't
So
know.
weird. But the above 65 population is 71.9% vaccinated. So that's
That's
something.
incredible.
Yeah.
Not my grandparents. They're in their 90s and they don't want it.
Oh no. Wow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So
Well, if they stay home, then that's okay,
Yeah.
probably.
Okay. Alrighty, I'm gonna close them down.
Looks like most people are taking all the time that they have, but they are about to be jumped back in with us. Everybody should be back now.
"45. Okay, we're back. Again, as usual, never enough time. We know that, but hopefully you got some good conversation going. So now I would love to hear what guidelines you all came up with for during the conversation to have a productive and good conversations on difficult topics. Type into the chat or feel free to come off mute and share. All right, in the chat, we have prepare notes in advance. Excellent, excellent. Try to pay attention to your own emotions, your breathing. Yeah, great. Be respectful, make sure the environment is appropriate. Excellent. Keep tone neutral. Good. And non-judgmental. Good. Set clear expectations and stick to them. Actively listen. Good. Give space and a pause after a difficult part of the conversation. Excellent. You know, in music, and you all heard I'm a musician, the silences, the rests, can be just as powerful and sometimes more powerful than the notes themselves. So excellent. Watch your expressions, especially on Zoom. Good. Ask questions. Yes. Why do you say that? Why do you think that? Perfect. Perfect. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. Great stuff. Great stuff. All right. So, oh, am I sharing? Guess I am. Didn't mean to start with, but so again, the wisdom of the crowd. Paraphrase that active listening. Remembering that there are 3 conversations in every difficult conversation. Preparing, have some notes, have some thoughts as to how the conversation should go before you enter into it. That will help you to feel more in control of yourself and not let emotions overtake you. Make sure you're ready to deal with any emotional triggers that may come up during the conversation. We talked about seeking to be understood, St. Francis's prayer. Find points of agreement overlap. You know, find a bridge. Find a bridge to yes. And handle your anger. If you get so overtaken by emotion, it's okay to say, I'm sorry, I statements. I'm a little too emotional right now. Can we take a break and come back when I'm ready to really listen to you and be fully present? Perfectly okay to do that. Accept and expect non-closure. Right? Okay. So next, what are some responses you can give when you hear a racist comment? Type in the chat, and we actually already saw a couple already, but what are some that you can think of? That's not appropriate. Okay, there's a response. Why are you saying that? There's a good one. Good. Is that really what you meant to say? Excellent, excellent, excellent. Feign misunderstanding and ask them to explain what they mean by the comment. Perfect, perfect. Learning stance, assume that learning stance. Ouch, yes. You can say ouch. Make them stop and ask you what you mean by ouch. If it's a joke, ask them why it's funny. Yes, make them explain. Explain it to me, Lucy. For those of you old enough to watch the Lucy show. Help me understand what you're trying to say. Perfect, perfect. So, you got them. So I'd be careful with saying that's an inappropriate comment, because that's placing a judgment, right? And that can put someone on the defensive right off the bat. You can say that offends me. Just say that and stop there. So I didn't quite hear you. Would you mind repeating that? Get them to repeat it again, because if they have to stop and think, they're not taken over by their emotion. Could you clarify what you mean? If it's a comment about race, age, ability, you can ask, is this person's race, sex, ability, or age or ability relevant to this conversation? That joke doesn't belong in modern time. And this is one that I'd be careful about, because it's again expressing a value judgment. But sometimes you can say that, depending upon the person you're with, right? Do you actually believe that? If so, why? Is that feigned misunderstanding? I forgot who mentioned that, but feigned misunderstanding, I think it was Allison. I didn't want to single you out before. So this is something you can do after a conversation, after you've observed a conversation. You can take the person who made the offensive remark aside and say, I didn't want to single you out before, but that comment made me uncomfortable. And here's why. Because they may not realize that what they said made you feel uncomfortable. Give them the benefit of the doubt. I don't really feel comfortable when you make comments like that. Expressing I statements, how I feel. Here's one. Do you have any evidence that supports that statement? I'm a data person. I'm a logical thinker. I'd love to hear some data about that. I'm back to one of the things we talked about before. Would you say that if the person in question was, and you can add white, male, straight, able-bodied, or young, if it's a derogatory comment about a person of color? So now you've got some tips as to responses to some offensive conversations, or some offensive statements that have been made. So to pull all this together, starting off with knowing your purpose. Know the purpose for the conversation you're having, if you can. Sometimes you're thrust into a difficult conversation, but many times you can prepare for it, right? Determine what you want the desired outcome to be before you start the conversation. Know when to raise the issue and when to let it go. Plan out the conversation. You want to avoid the impetuous conversations, because those are the conversations where emotions can take over. Switch to that learning stance, like St. Francis's prayer, right? Seek to understand, not be confrontational. Begin from the third story. So what Doug Stone and Sheila Heen and Bruce Patton mean by that is put yourself as a neutral observer to the conversation. And again, try to understand both sides. Try to make sure that both sides come out equally in the conversation. Find points of agreement or places where there's overlap. And then once you're comfortable that you've understood each other's perspective, you can shift to, well, let's solve the problem that we're talking about, if there's a problem that needs to be solved. And you can take the lead by paraphrasing what you think is the situation and the problem at hand, and asking, how do we solve this? How do we solve this problem? Not how do you solve it or how do I solve it? How do we solve this problem? All right. So questions about any of this? Feel free to come off mute or type into chat. All right, okay, great, really helpful. How do you plan out the conversation if you're trying to be an active listener? So this is before you even meet the person in the conversation. You try to plan it out. If you know that you're gonna have this conversation, think about how you want it to go. Do you want the other person to start or do you want to start? Think about if the person says something offensive, stop, take a breath. All right, how do I want this to play out? I want to make sure I'm going to ask to understand before I make a statement or a judgment. Plan that out. Plan how you're going to respond. Can you help change someone's perspective? Yes, you can, and it's through taking this learning stance. Take the learning stance. That's what allows them to be open and once they're comfortable that they've gotten their point across, then you can share your perspective. Share the data, and hopefully they're a logical person and they'll deal with data. But maybe you have to find out what their thinking style is. Are they a logical person? Are they a creative person? And then you can form your statements, your argument, if you will, that they will hear. What if there's trouble finding any points of agreement or overlap? Ask the question, is there anything on which we can agree? If there isn't, then you've done the best you can. If there's a problem that has to be solved, even if you can't find a place to agree, you can ask the question, so how are we going to solve this problem? What would you suggest that we do? I don't want you to have to solve this by yourself. I want to be in on this. What can we do? Right? So the point of overlap already is, if there's a problem, you both want to solve it. Hopefully that's a point of agreement. Are there any specific tips you have on having continuous hard conversations with family, where a space may have to be shared post-conversation? Well, I think I go back to, what do you have in common? Your family. Right? So continuous conversations. I'm going to ask you, Caitlin, to come off mute and share a little bit more about what you're thinking about.
Sure.
Do you have a specific situation in mind?
Yeah, I'll try and keep the details low that we don't take up too much time. But I was sharing with my group how I try and bring up like weekly, bi-weekly conversations with my father on specific topics. And I do go into these knowing they're going to be hard conversations. But however, sharing space afterwards can sometimes get really hard when, even if I know there won't be like a conclusion, sharing space without that conclusion can sometimes get really uncomfortable. So I guess I was just wondering if you have any tips on how to navigate the emotional side of these conversations within close relationships, even after conversations have happened.
So thank you for that. I would say that one of the ways to help with that is those conversational norms we talked about. If you establish up front that we may not come to agreement during this conversation, and that's okay. We still love each other. That makes the post-conversation, the post-emotions, a little bit easier to navigate, a little bit easier to deal with. If you don't set that up first, it's really difficult once the emotions are up, and you have to just agree. You agree to disagree. That's something you can agree on, right? You can agree to disagree on this point or at this point in time. And you can ask, so can we continue this conversation later? If you get agreement on that, then the time after the conversation is going to be a little bit better. All right, so I wanted to spend a little bit of time, just a few minutes, going back to the questions that you all came up with in the very beginning. I know we've got 2 minutes left, but hopefully you have some ideas on how to deal with these questions now. So how do I call out someone who makes a racist remark? Right? Well, what do we say? We ask, can you explain that? Should we strive to live in a colorblind society? Well, here's the problem with colorblindness. It invalidates the experience of a person of color. Right? To say I'm colorblind, I don't see you as a colored person, as a person of color, means you don't see my experience. You don't see the trauma that I may have had to endure. Ethical communication issues, ethics are really tricky. You know, and we have Western ethics and we have Eastern ethics. Dealing with those ethical issues really bears having some conversational norms up front. The power dynamic, when a supervisor or a person in power says something problematic. So what Doug Patton and Sheila Heen and Doug Stone, Sheila Heen and Bruce Patton say about the power dynamic, one of the things that they say is recognize that the power dynamic is in play and that the person you're speaking to does have power. And they feel that they have responsibility. So if in your conversation you can acknowledge one, that they have that power and that they have some responsibility, and phrase your comments such that you're supportive of them fulfilling their responsibility. It may be that you're trying to just enlighten them on something they may not be aware of, but sometimes people in power don't want to be enlightened because they feel like they have to know everything. So if you can make this gracious space almost where you acknowledge that they're in power and just ask, and you can ask, did you consider X? Or help me understand how you incorporated X into your thought process. I want to learn from you. I want to understand. Coworker, we kind of talked about that too, that learning stance. AmeriCorps member tells us AmeriCorps is systematically racist because it was attainable for low-income individuals to serve in the program and had no idea to respond. So do you have an idea now of how to respond? I'm not sure who asked that question, but do you have a little bit more of an idea of how to respond with that, to that? Whoever asked that. And any of these others, I know we're at 3:01, so we really need to let you go. But hopefully you've gotten some tips on how to address these difficult topics and difficult conversations, and good luck.
Thank you. So thanks, James McKim, once again for being with us today. I think this was a really interesting and enlightening discussion for a lot of us. Hopefully the breakout rooms were helpful as well. And as a reminder, the recording of this session and the slides will be shared at volunteernh.org, and we'll send you an email to let you know when they're posted. Registration's still open for our remaining sessions. There are 2 more to choose from this afternoon, plus our trivia contest and reflection session tomorrow during the lunch hour. In the chat, you'll see a link to our conference survey. And if you submit this by the end of the month, you'll be entered into a drawing to win a prize. For another chance to win, you can also submit an intent to nominate form for the 2021 Spirit of New Hampshire Awards, which is your opportunity to recognize an outstanding volunteer, group of volunteers, or an organization that champions volunteerism. If you fill out the form, we'll reach out to you once we begin officially accepting nominations later this spring or summer. Thank you all so much for being here, and enjoy the rest of your day.